So how do we find our strengths? Find out today on this episode of IncreMental Health Tips. Welcome to IncreMental Health Tips. My name is Jared, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Liz. Today we're going to be discussing how we can find our strengths. So first, to get into this, I think it's important that we deal with the elephant in the room, which is someone's expectations of what we mean by strengths. So what is it we mean by that? So when you think of strengths, you might think of being great at something, but a strength might also be something that you're just better than average at, or even average at. So it's really important that before you can really begin this process, you consider what do you mean by strengths, because depending on your expectations, that's going to impact your results quite tremendously. Our expectations play a really important role into how all of this process unfolds and plays out. So Liz, the first topic, an aspect of finding your strengths, is to reflect on things that you've demonstrated success in before. So what are some ways, or what recommendations do you make to clients about this reflection process?
Well, I think some of the more obvious strengths that people may pick up on is things like if someone's really good at math and they naturally just figure out math equations, or if they're very verbal and they naturally just come up with the right words. Those, I think, are strengths that people have an easier time identifying because they're just more obvious to everyone who's involved. But if someone just has a natural bent towards strategic or analytical thinking, that might not come up as obviously as other skill sets. So I think just trying to think about how is it you're naturally wired? What is it you gravitate towards? And at what points in your life have you done well? And what were the things you were doing? What were the unique skills you were using at that time?
Well, as well, to consider the context of the strength and try to apply the strength across the context. So what I mean is, let's say you have the gift of gab and you're very social. So a strength could be managing conflict in your workplace, but maybe you don't think of your ability to talk to people and ability to relate to people and really build that rapport. You might not think of that as a strength, but it actually could be really beneficial to de-escalating potential conflicts or even avoiding them altogether.
Yeah, mediation is a really important skill set, and it's something a lot of people, they have to get trained in order to do, and then there's other people who it's just more natural for them, and they can still benefit from the training. But if you are more naturally wired to something when you're trained to do it, then it's easier to excel in that area than someone who has to learn the skill set and it's not a natural fit.
The other thing I want to touch on is a strength doesn't mean that we are just out of the box gifted with it. If you think of people you may know who are very physically fit or strong, they didn't start that way. They had a process of building their strength. And so just because you could do things better or you're not the greatest you can be at something does not mean that that is not an area of strength for you. It just means that you have more aptitude with that than other things. So that's the other thing I wanted to touch on. The second part, in addition to reflection, we can really gain a lot of valuable insight from our friends and our family and ask them, so what do you think my strengths are? You know, they may actually mention things or bring things up that you've never thought about.
Yeah, it's true that sometimes other people, they can pick up on things about you that you didn't recognize about yourself because you just think everyone thinks that way. There's different ways that I think that are just completely natural to me. And until I did some personality assessments, I just thought everyone thought that way. So learning to recognize what your strengths are can be quite challenging. And this is one of the things, as a therapist, I was trained to look for client strengths and help clients to identify strengths that they have while trying to solve their own problem. Because there's usually some ways in which a client has some strengths that they might not be recognizing as strengths because they're still struggling. Even though they're doing some positive things, they're not getting the results they want. And so they dismiss the strengths that they actually have.
Well, there's this tendency to focus on our areas of deficiency. And as we've mentioned before on this channel, it's insufficient to just focus on the negative aspects or the things you want to improve, because if you only focus on that, then you're not actually nourishing the things you're good at. And so that balance is really important. So being able to identify your strengths and recognize your strengths can be really important to your personal development too. And oftentimes it's really overlooked in that process. So obviously, as well, we should also mention that there are several assessment tools that can help you. Maybe your friends or family don't really have all that great insight, or nothing was really significant that they contributed and you can't think of anything. There are actually some assessment tools out there that can really be used as a starting point, and it can really inform your reflection. And sometimes if you take one of these assessment tools and you share the results with somebody else, they can confirm and say, oh, yes, that's definitely something I've observed of you, or, I've never thought of it that way. And so even if they can't help you in that exact moment, by sharing your results with others who you can trust and confide in, they may be able to keep an eye out, and it might inform them, and they may be able to help you down the road as well. So one assessment tool I'm familiar with and I've taken is called Strengths Finder, and that's readily available. It's in the book Strengths Quest. I don't have the author's names just off the top of my head, but it is a resource that is readily available off Amazon or wherever you find books. What are some others? I know in your graduate school you went over several.
So in my schooling, we went over the MBTI personality assessment and the Kolb learning styles. I really appreciated the Kolb learning styles one because it looks at whether or not someone is more reflective or action oriented. Because some people, they learn by just jumping in and doing a task, and other people learn more by reflecting. Like they'll read a book and then they'll take some time to think about how to do it, and that's the process they learn by. So I really enjoy learning reflectively. I scored like 80% on the reflective, and this assessment was done for a class that required jumping in and learning and practicing. So it was a real challenge for me to try a different style of learning and see the advantages of learning by just jumping in and doing something and trying new things. And it also looks at whether or not someone thinks in an abstract or concrete way. So the difference between abstract and concrete is that a concrete has more to do with the things that you can feel and touch and see, whereas the abstract, it's a little bit harder to describe. And so someone who talks in an abstract way, you might not really be sure that you're understanding them in the way that they intend for you to understand them, because they're using more abstract terminology and concepts.
Well, so before we run out of time, there's a couple additional things I think are important to our listeners. One, when we're considering these strengths, we should really try to avoid comparing ourselves to others, because everybody is ultimately different and everybody has different strengths. And so if we're using somebody else as a baseline for how I'm supposed to be at this, then that can actually be really unhealthy because we might actually be very different than that other person. And so making sure that we're not making undue comparisons. And then the second aspect before we wrap up is it's important that we also understand that any of these assessment tools or the reflections we make are not deterministic of you. You can actually, and throughout your life, you will find that you develop and have different strengths.
Yeah, and I think on that point, sometimes someone can have a strength that is so strong that other people might see it as a weakness because it's just an unrefined strength. And so recognizing as well that strengths can need a little bit of refinement to be used at their best, I think can also be a really important point to remember.
Well, and also that our strengths develop in areas where we struggle. As a runner, for example, in high school, I was never a very fast runner. And that was really something that I felt quite bad about because everybody else would beat me in the various track and field events. But what we actually discovered, or what I had discovered, is while I don't run fast, I can run for a really long time. And so it just took that figuring out and discovering it for a track coach to approach me and say, well, have you ever, yeah, you're not fast, but like, have you ever thought about trying a longer distance? And I was actually quite successful at distance running. So it's oftentimes in areas where we think we are weak, and I am genuinely, I'm not a very fast runner, but it's those areas of weakness and deficiency where we can actually discover or persevere and work through and find ways to develop and cultivate our strengths. Well, that's all the time we have for today, but if you enjoy our content, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. We upload new full podcast episodes every Tuesday at 11 p.m. Eastern, and on YouTube, we actually have been doing daily shorts videos with quick, little, tiny, it's less than a minute long, and it's little mental health tips to get you going, and it's really a perfect way to start your day or end your day, depending on your schedule. So in the meantime, and until next time, remember that small steps can lead to big changes, and we'll see you next time.